pastor that I had for my first assignment had the tradition of trying to find a theme to use during all of his homilies for the Triduum, and so I've tried to pick that up from him. I didn't pick up many habits from him, but that's one that I did. And so I want to stick with a particular theme as we go through today, tomorrow on Good Friday, and then Saturday for the Easter Vigil. And I'll develop the theme a little bit more completely tomorrow. I don't want to jump the gun. But the theme is pouring out. Right? Jesus pouring himself out for us. And so that idea of Christ pouring himself out for us will be the sort of guide for our meditations and for my preaching over these 3 days. So tonight I want to speak of 3 ways tied to this celebration that the Lord pours himself out for us. The first way that he does this, on Holy Thursday in particular, is through service. So Christ pours himself out for us in his service, and he shows this to us at the Last Supper with his apostles by washing their feet. Now, we can imagine, right, our feet are generally pretty clean today, right? Most of us wear socks and shoes. They're protected from the elements. We don't walk a whole lot. But in those days, their feet were probably pretty nasty, right? They wore sandals. They walked pretty much everywhere they went. And so their feet would have attracted a lot of dirt and would have been probably not just dirty, but just very hardened. And so Jesus, right, as an act of humility, pours himself out in service to his apostles and gives them that example of how they are to act. Right? We heard in the gospel that he rises from the table, he takes off his outer garment, and he bends down and he washes the apostles' feet and he dries them with a towel. Now, this pouring out of Jesus in theological talk is called kenosis, right? Complete self-emptying. And I immediately went back to what we call the Christological hymn that we find in St. Paul's letter to the Philippians, that Christ, though he was in the form of God, did not deem equality with God something to be grasped at, but rather he emptied himself and took on the form of a slave. Right? You could imagine that would be the work of a servant, of a slave, to bend down and to clean the feet of their masters. And so Jesus pours himself out in service of his apostles. And again, he gives us that example of how we are to act. Right? We call ourselves Christians, followers of Christ. And so we have to be in service to others also. And on this Holy Thursday, when we remember these events, right, the church makes this very visible because we wash the feet of people at Mass. And so I'm reminded in a very stark way that I am to be a servant. And because we're human beings, right, I can be told it, but it's much more effective if I have to do it. And so the church tells me today that I am to wash the feet of people at Mass. And so that's the first way that Jesus pours himself out for us this Holy Thursday in that act of service. The second way that Jesus does this, that he empties himself, that he pours himself out for us, is in the Eucharist. It's not very often that the church instructs priests the topic of their homily. But tonight on Holy Thursday it says that after the gospel, the priest is to preach and he is to call to mind the 2 principal realities that we're celebrating today. One being the Holy Eucharist. I won't tell you the second one just yet because it would give away my third point. But that the Lord pours himself out in the Holy Eucharist. Right? Imagine you knew you were going to die the next day. Right? You knew you were going to die tomorrow. Most people, right, have in their mind what they call a bucket list, right? Things that they want to do before they kick the bucket. Things they want to do before they die. And you could imagine that if we knew we were going to die at a particular time, the closer we got to that moment, the more we would hone in on those things that we really want to do. Everything that's not really important would be pushed aside, and we would do those things that we know to be critically important. This is exactly what Jesus is doing. On the night before he dies, he spends time with his apostles. He shows them that they are to pour themselves out in service, but he also gives them the gift of the Eucharist. Right? Literally pouring himself out for them, leaving for them and for us. Right? The sacrifice of his love, leaving for them and for us his body, blood, soul, and divinity. Right? Not just to adore from afar, not just to talk about, not just to sort of see over there, but to consume. A complete self-emptying, a complete pouring out of himself for the sake of his flock. Right? And we heard in that second reading that he gives his apostles that commandment to do this in memory of him. Right? St. Paul is writing to the early church in Corinth, telling them the events of the Last Supper. Right? That we do, this supper, this meal, is not just something that we made up, but this is what Jesus himself instructed the apostles to do on the night before he died. And so Jesus, once again, pouring himself out for us in the Eucharist, so that we can receive, right? So that we can be strengthened to be able to imitate him in that act of service that he did in the washing of the apostles' feet. The third way that the priest, or that Jesus instructs us or pours himself out for us on Holy Thursday, is the second point that the church tells priests to preach on for this celebration. And that is the priestly office. Right? So the Eucharist and the priesthood is intimately bound up together. When Jesus institutes the Eucharist at the Last Supper, he also, right, as we heard from St. Paul, gives the apostles the power to be able to do what he is commanding them to do. He gives them the power to be able to celebrate the Eucharist, right? To do for others what he is doing for them. Right? And this priestly office kind of ties all of this celebration together, and it ties these first 2 points, these 2 ways that Jesus pours himself out together. Because the Eucharist, or the priesthood, holy orders, is one of the 2 sacraments of service. Sacrament of holy orders and the sacrament of marriage are sacraments of service, right? They're not primarily meant for the person that receives them. They're primarily meant for others. In marriage, it's primarily meant for the spouse, right? The good of the spouse and the good of the children. And for holy orders, it's meant for the people that person is sent to serve. And so when I laid down on the floor of the cathedral almost 7 years ago, right, I was ordained to be of service to the people of God in the Diocese of Lafayette. And for the past 2 years, I've been sent specifically to pour myself out for you. Sometimes I live up to that. Other times I don't. Sometimes I'm very willing to pour myself out, to empty myself. Other times I just plain feel empty and I'm selfish. But it's meant for others. And I'm only going to become holy as a priest if I serve others, if I follow Christ in that pouring out of myself. The priesthood was instituted along with the Eucharist because the priests are the ones who are to offer that sacrifice. Right? So it is intimately tied up with the sacrament of the Eucharist. Right? He is telling and commissioning the apostles to carry on what he is doing. Right? And we gain strength from doing this, right? We as Christians are called to imitate Christ and pour ourselves out, and we gain strength from this. Right? The more I commit to pouring myself out rather than being selfish, the more I'm rejuvenated in my service. Right? Those of you who are married have probably experienced this too. Right? At times you want to be selfish, I'm sure. You say, no, I don't want to do that. Or you do it grudgingly. I'm going to do it, but I don't want to. When we have that attitude, it's not life-giving. But when we say, even though I don't want to do this, I'm going to do it out of love for my spouse. When I say, even though I don't want to do this, I'm going to do it out of love for the people. Somehow, it actually gives me energy rather than taking it from me. Right? I still go to bed tired, but it's a good tired. And so the Lord pours himself out to the apostles in that gift of the priesthood on Holy Thursday. Right? This is why we also celebrate today, we did it this morning at the cathedral, the Chrism Mass. Right? It's the tradition on Holy Thursday that all the priests of a diocese gather together in the cathedral, right, that seat of the bishop, with the bishop as the head, and renew their priestly promises. Right? Because this is the day that we celebrate that institution of the priesthood. And so we renew our promises, renew our willingness to pour ourselves out for the flock entrusted to us. This is one of my favorite things to think about because of the way that I was formed. So I studied, as you know, in Rome for my last 4 years of seminary formation. And for 2 of those years, my apostolate work was to give tours of St. Peter's Basilica. It was tough, but I suffered through it. And one of my favorite parts of the Basilica to show to people and to tell them was a mural of Ananias and Sapphira. So in the Acts of the Apostles, there's this story. So they lived a communal life. Right? All of the Christians would live a communal life. They would give over all of their goods. And the people who didn't have enough, they would use from that to give. And the people who had surplus would give to the surplus fund. And everybody had what they needed. Well, Ananias and Sapphira were becoming Christians. And they were supposed to hand over all of their property, everything they owned, to be able to do this. But they came up with this scheme where they would hold back something for themselves. And in this mural, it showed that they're being struck dead because they lied to the apostles about giving everything, because they held something back. And this mural is situated right as you walk out of the sacristy into the basilica. And so as I was ordained a deacon in that basilica, the first thing that I saw as I walked into the church to go and lay down my life was that image, right? Reminding that I cannot hold anything back. That I am being ordained for service to the church. That I'm going to show that willingness to lay everything down by literally laying down on the floor during the Litany of Saints. And that my entire life from that moment on has to be a pouring out of myself, a complete emptying of myself for the sake of the people. Right? That's why we celebrate today both this Holy Thursday Mass of the Lord's Supper and the Chrism Mass. That's why I felt no shame. I have to remind myself that I can do this sometimes. I felt no shame walking into the cathedral today for that Mass and saying, you know what? My intention for this Mass is going to be for me. So that I can be a holy priest. So that I more and more can pour out everything in service of Christ and His church and His people. That is why I have no reservations tonight to beg you to pray for us priests. Right? You are so good to us. I ask you to continue to pray for us. Right? Pray for the priests that we have. Pray for those priests that are struggling. Right? I am so happy to be a priest, and I still go through difficult times. I can't imagine being a priest and doubting the call. And so pray for those men who are struggling. Pray for those men who are doubting God's call for them. And I beg you to pray for more priests. Right? We're so lucky here in Church Point to have not one but 2 full-time priests. A lot of places don't have any priests. A lot of places, even our own country, are combining parishes so that one priest can take care of 2 or 3 or 4 or more parishes. Right, Father Rosa, I was in contact with someone, I think in Germany recently, who had 10 parishes. 10. And so we need to pray for vocations. And finally, I ask you to pray for yourselves. Right? Pray for good, holy families, because priests don't grow on trees. If they did, I would have a lot more to deal with. Right? I'd have a lot more seminarians. But priests come from families. And they come from those families where they witness their mothers and their fathers imitating Christ, pouring themselves out for their spouse, pouring themselves out for their children. And so I assure you of my prayers for you, and I ask you for your prayers for me. Right? That we would raise up more and more holy families. And so that more and more we can have holy priests that continue to serve us and that continue to give us that most precious gift of the Eucharist.